Wyoming Territory, 1887. The wind carried the scent of rain and loneliness across the plains when Clara Weston stepped off the stagecoach at Silver Creek, a place where hope was as fragile as the prairie grass. She had come to marry a man she'd never met, a widowed rancher named Eli Hart, who carried more silence than words and more grief than most hearts could bear. When Clara finally whispered, "I can't have children," Eli just smiled beneath his weathered hat and said, "Good. I've got enough kids for both of us." But what kind of man smiles at such a confession? And what kind of woman dares to believe she deserves a second chance at love, when her heart and her body have already failed her once, in a land where men were forged by storms and women by loss? Could two broken souls still build a home together? Could kindness bloom where pain once lived tonight? We'll ride into that story of love, reborn in dust and rain, and how sometimes the gentlest hearts hide behind the roughest hands. If you believe love deserves a second chance, hit like, share, and subscribe, and let's begin. Nevada Territory, 1885. The afternoon sun hung low, painting the land in shades of copper and dust. The stagecoach rattled across the open plain before coming to a halt in a town so small it could vanish between gusts of wind. The sign read Willow Bend. From the coach stepped Evelyn Pierce, a woman no older than 30, dressed in traveling gray that had long lost its shape. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she held a small trunk. Everything she owned fit neatly inside it. Inside were two faded dresses, a worn Bible, and a photograph of her mother smiling beneath an apple tree back in Virginia. She had not looked at that picture since the day she buried her mother, but somehow, on this journey west, she had needed it close. Evelyn was a mail-order bride, though the word still felt foreign in her mind. Bride. It sounded too hopeful, too clean. She had answered an advertisement from a rancher in the Nevada Territory, a man seeking companionship more than romance, or so his letter had claimed. A quiet woman with good sense and steady hands. He had written, "No need for children, just someone who understands the land." As the dust settled, she saw him, Caleb Rowan, standing beside a weathered hitching post, hat pulled low, shoulders broad, boots dusty from a lifetime of long roads. His presence carried a stillness that made the air seem to pause. People in the town whispered about him, a man who'd lost his wife in a barn fire, a man who'd fought in a war and came back half a ghost. When their eyes met, Evelyn felt a shiver not of fear exactly, but of something nameless. He nodded once. "Miss Pierce." "Yes," she managed, her voice softer than she intended. He took the trunk from her hands with surprising gentleness. "The wagon's this way." No words of welcome, no smile, just a quiet that filled the space between them. The road to his ranch stretched out through the valley, framed by sagebrush and a horizon so wide it could swallow a person whole. Evelyn sat stiffly, her bonnet tugged low as wind swept her hair loose. Caleb drove without speaking. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm, the only sound in that endless world. She tried to imagine what kind of life waited for her at the end of this road. She wondered if she had been foolish to come, but where else was there to go? The East had given her nothing but graves and memories. Out here, maybe she could become someone new. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Rowan, I should tell you something before we reach your home." He didn't turn, only gave a small nod. "Go ahead. I can't have children." The words hung in the air, fragile and raw. She had practiced saying them, but out here with the smell of dust and leather and sunlight, they sounded heavier. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then, almost under his breath, he murmured, "Good." Evelyn blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. He looked at her then, his eyes the color of storm clouds. "I've got enough kids for both of us." And only then did she notice the small faces peering from the wagon bed, 2 boys and a little girl, quiet as shadows. The youngest clutched a rag doll missing one arm. The oldest, maybe 10, watched her with cautious curiosity. Evelyn's throat tightened. She nodded once, unable to find her voice. When they reached the ranch, the sun had slipped low behind the mountains. The house stood at the edge of a field, gone golden in the dying light. Not grand, but solid. Weathered boards, a porch with one step sagging, and the smell of smoke from the kitchen chimney. Caleb helped her down and gestured toward the door. "You'll have the front room. There's a lock inside, if you need it." That simple kindness caught her off guard. "Thank you," she whispered. The children stayed close to their father, eyes wide and uncertain. Evelyn knelt to meet them, unsure what to say. "Hello," she began, but they only stared. Later, as the night settled over the valley, Caleb brought her a lantern and a wool blanket. "It gets cold toward morning," he said quietly. "Sleep well. Miss Pierce." He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "You don't have to call me Miss Pierce," she said softly. "Evelyn will do." He hesitated, then nodded. "Good night, Evelyn." After he left, she sat by the small window, watching the moon rise over the open land. For the first time in years, she wasn't surrounded by walls or whispers, only silence, wide and honest. She touched the photograph in her pocket. "I think you'd like it here." "Mama," she whispered, "it smells like beginnings." That night, as the wind hummed through the cottonwoods, Evelyn lay awake listening to the soft breathing of the children in the next room. She thought of Caleb's quiet voice, the way his words carried both weariness and mercy. "Good. I've got enough kids for both of us." Maybe this wasn't a mistake after all. But even as she drifted toward sleep, she felt the ache of the unknown, what had shaped this man, what pain he carried in the quiet hours. She sensed that beneath his calm lived a sorrow too heavy for one soul, and she wondered if love, or something like it, could still find room between 2 people who had already lost so much. Tomorrow, she would learn what kind of life this land demanded, and whether her heart could survive it. By morning, the wind had shifted, bringing with it the scent of rain and the uneasy knowledge that in Willow Bend, kindness and danger often wore the same face. Evelyn Pierce woke to the sound of hooves and children's laughter. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then her eyes caught the rough timber beams above her, the thin morning light spilling through the small window, and it all came back the long road west. The stranger who had called her name, the way he'd said, "Good. I've got enough kids for both of us." She washed her face in the basin by the bed, smoothed her skirt, and opened the door to the scent of coffee. In the kitchen, Caleb Rowan stood by the stove, pouring tin mugs of the dark brew, while his youngest daughter tried to braid his hair with a bit of twine. The sight startled her, not because it was strange, but because it was tender. When he noticed her, Caleb straightened. "Mornin'. Evelyn?" She nodded, voice small. "Morning. Mr. Rowan." He smiled slightly. "Caleb's fine." Then, with a hint of mischief, he added, "Or you can call me sir, if you're partial to formality." Her cheeks warmed despite herself. The children giggled, and he cast them a mock frown before turning back to the stove. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. stepping carefully around the children. "You're not intrudin'. You live here now." He poured a cup and offered it to her. "It's strong. Might chase off the nerves." She took it, fingers brushing his. The warmth of the cup seeped into her palms, but it was the warmth in his voice that unsettled her, most quiet, steady, carrying something like humor under the dust. Then, almost too casually, he said, "You sleep all right. No ghosts in that room yet." She blinked. Ghosts. He gave her that half smile again, the kind that could mean a dozen things. "Don't worry, darlin'. I don't bite unless you ask." The word struck her like a spark in dry grass. The children went still. Evelyn froze, color flooding her cheeks. For a moment, she saw the shadow of every man she'd feared before, the kind who used charm as a weapon. Caleb must have seen the fear flicker across her face, because his expression changed instantly. He looked down, removing his hat as though ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low and rough. "That was a poor attempt at humor. Guess I've been too long around cattle and not enough around folks." The silence stretched, thick as the morning fog. Then the little girl tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, "Pa, you made her scared." Caleb crouched, resting a gentle hand on his daughter's head. "You're right, honey. Sometimes grown-ups forget their manners." Evelyn found her voice again, soft but steady. "It's all right. Mr. Caleb, I just didn't expect you to joke." His eyes lifted to hers, gray and storm-worn. "But honest, most folks don't." He stood, brushed his hands on his jeans, and turned toward the open door. "You should come outside once you've eaten. I'll show you the place. There's plenty of sky to get lost in, but I reckon you'll like it." When he left, the children began chattering again, their laughter lightening the room. Evelyn sipped her coffee, trying to quiet the trembling in her hands. Something inside her wanted to trust him. Something older and more wounded wanted to run. Outside, the ranch stretched in every direction, acres of golden grass rolling toward blue mountains. A windmill creaked lazily near the barn. The smell of hay and horses hung in the air. Caleb was fixing a fence post when she approached, her skirts lifting slightly in the breeze. He looked up, but didn't speak right away. Instead, he offered her a small smile, as though to say it's safe now. "You can walk the fence line if you'd like," he said. "Just watch where you step, rattlers, like the sun, same as we do." She nodded, eyes tracing the horizon. "It's beautiful here. Feels like the world never ends." He leaned on the post, squinting toward the distance. Sometimes that's the blessing. Sometimes it's the curse. They stood quietly for a while, the wind filling the spaces words couldn't. At last, he spoke again. "You didn't sleep much last night." She turned, startled. "How could you tell? You've got the look of someone listening to ghosts." She let out a faint laugh. "Maybe I was." He studied her, but not in the way that made her shrink. It was a gaze that seemed to see through the fear, not into it. "You don't owe me your past, Evelyn," he said, "but you should know. This place, it's not built for secrets. The wind'll carry them clear to town." "I'll remember that," she whispered. He nodded once, then went back to his work, hammer striking wood with steady rhythm. She watched him, noticing how even in silence he carried a kind of dignity, the sort born from years of labor, loss, and the decision to keep going anyway. And somewhere between the sound of the hammer and the sigh of the wind, the tension that had filled the air that morning began to ease. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Evelyn stood on the porch, watching the children chase each other through the tall grass. The youngest tripped and fell, and before Evelyn could move, Caleb was there, lifting the child gently into his arms. His laughter, deep and rare, rolled through the air like thunder breaking after a long drought. She felt it then, not love. Not yet, but something that might one day lead there. A flicker of trust, a sense that beneath the hard lines and scars, this man might hold more kindness than the world ever gave him credit for. That night, as the lamps dimmed and the prairie winds whispered through the open window, Evelyn Pierce realized that sometimes danger didn't come from a man's rough hands, but from the gentleness that could undo a guarded heart. By dawn, the world outside had changed its color again. The Nevada plains stretched wide and quiet beneath a pale gold sky, and the first light slid through the cracks of the small house like a promise. Evelyn stood by the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, watching the land breathe itself awake. It felt both endless and confining, the kind of silence that could either heal you or break you clean in two. Caleb Rowan was already outside, feeding the horses. He moved with the rhythm of someone who had been doing the same thing for years, each motion slow but sure, as though the world could collapse around him and he would still finish his work before noticing. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her boots creaking against the worn boards. "Do you ever get used to the quiet out here?" she asked softly. He glanced over his shoulder, a faint smile in his voice. "You don't get used to it. You just learn to listen different." She nodded, letting her eyes follow the horizon. The wind brushed her hair loose, carrying the faint scent of sage. For a moment, she thought she heard music, but it was only the windmill creaking, slow and steady. After breakfast, Caleb hitched the wagon. "I'll show you the rest of the place," he said. "It ain't much, but it holds together." They rode out beyond the barn, past the grazing pasture where the grass bent like ripples on water. The land was dry, but not dead stubbornly alive, clinging to life the way only the West could. Evelyn's eyes took in every detail: the split-rail fences patched with rope, the lonely cottonwood near the creek, the line of distant hills shimmering in heat. When the wagon stopped, Caleb gestured toward a small cabin at the far edge of the property. Its roof sagged slightly, and the paint had long since faded into the color of dust. "That was my father's old bunkhouse," he said. "Hasn't been used much since before." She turned to him. "Before." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked up to the door and pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. The single window let in a thin beam of light that fell across the floorboards like a memory. "This'll be yours if you want it," Caleb said. "There's a lock inside, and a stove that still works, mostly. You don't owe me a thing for it." Evelyn blinked, surprised by the quiet finality of his words. I thought I'd stay in the house." He met her eyes, not with distance, but with something gentler. "You could," he said, "but I figured you might want your own space a while. Someplace you can breathe without me or the kids underfoot." She looked around the small room again. It was plain a cot, a chair, a shelf with an old lantern, but somehow it felt safer than any parlor or boarding house she'd ever known. The kind of space where a person could learn how to be whole again. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Don't say nothing yet," he replied. "Just rest." That evening, Evelyn lit the small stove and boiled water for tea. The air inside the cabin grew warm and still. She sat by the window, watching the sun slide down behind the hills, and thought of how strange it felt to be given space instead of demands. Back east, men had always wanted something from her obedience, her silence, her body. But Caleb Rowan, with his quiet strength and weathered face, had offered her nothing but a key. Outside. She heard laughter, the children's voices floating across the yard. It struck her suddenly how easily joy lived here, even in small corners of hardship. She pressed a hand against the window pane and closed her eyes. Maybe this was what safety sounded like. Later that night, there was a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, Caleb stood there, holding a lantern and a small stack of firewood. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his face tired but kind. "Thought you might need this," he said. "The nights get colder than you'd expect." She stepped aside to let him in. "You're thoughtful," she said quietly. He set the wood near the stove. "Just trying to make sure you don't freeze to death your first week here." A small smile tugged at her lips. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Rowan." He gave a low chuckle. "Caleb, remember." Their eyes met then, and for a long heartbeat, neither spoke. There was no rush, no flirtation, just two people sharing the same small silence. Then he cleared his throat, hat twisting in his hands. "Well, I'll let you rest." As he turned to go, she said softly, "Caleb," he paused at the door. "Thank you. For the room. For not asking too much." He nodded once, eyes lowering. "You're welcome, Evelyn. Around here, a person's got to have a place that feels like theirs, even if it takes a while to believe it." When he was gone, Evelyn leaned against the door, her heart unsteady but calm. It had been years since anyone had given her a gift that wasn't tied to a price. She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the coyotes cry out in the distance and the soft creak of the windmill turning. And for the first time since leaving Virginia, she did not feel like prey. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of rain and smoke, and before the night was over, Evelyn Pierce would learn that kindness could come quietly through a half-open door. The storm arrived just after dusk. It began with a whisper through the sagebrush, then built into a restless howl that swept across Willow Bend, rattling shutters and stirring ghosts in the rafters. Inside her small cabin, Evelyn sat by the stove, watching the flame shiver with every gust. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to convince herself that she wasn't afraid. But fear, she'd learned, didn't always need a reason. Sometimes it came simply because you were alone. The roof creaked. The wind pressed against the windows like invisible hands. She thought of the miles of open land around her, of the mountains too far to reach, and of the man who had offered her a home but asked for nothing in return. Caleb Rowan. The name felt both strange and solid in her thoughts. She tried to write in her mother's old journal, but the pen scratched against the paper like dry leaves. Finally, she gave up, set it aside, and lay down on the narrow bed. The blanket was thin, the night was not. Somewhere outside, a door banged open, and for a moment she thought she saw the flash of a lantern. Then footsteps, slow, steady, moving closer. Her pulse quickened. Instinct told her to lock the door, but another voice whispered, "Wait." A shadow fell across the window, and then came a gentle knock, 3 soft taps that sounded more like a question than a command. "Evelyn." The voice was low, careful. "Caleb." She rose, barefoot, and opened the door just enough to see him standing there, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Storm's turning colder. Thought you might need this." In his hands was a folded wool blanket and a tin cup of water. The lantern light made the rain on his coat shimmer like silver. Evelyn hesitated. She had known men who used kindness as a lure, who spoke softly until the door opened wider. But Caleb didn't step forward. He didn't reach for her. He simply waited. "Thank you," she said at last. Her voice barely rose above the wind. He nodded once, handed her the blanket, and placed the cup on the small table near the door. "Didn't want you catching a chill." Then he turned to leave. No lingering glance, no word beyond what was needed. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, holding the blanket against her chest, watching the light of his lantern move away through the rain until it disappeared behind the barn. Only when the darkness returned did she realize she was crying. Not from fear this time, but from the simple shock of being cared for without a price. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. When she pulled it around herself, warmth seeped through the cold places inside her, the ones that had been numb for too many years. She lay back on the bed, listening to the storm beat against the roof, and whispered to the quiet, "He didn't touch me. He just didn't want me to be cold." The words drifted into the night like a prayer. The next morning dawned soft and gray. Rain still clung to the earth, and puddles mirrored the open sky. Evelyn stepped outside, the blanket draped around her shoulders, and saw Caleb by the corral, checking the horses. His youngest boy trailed behind him, trying to match his father's long stride. When he looked up and saw her, he tipped his hat not with the swagger of a man expecting thanks, but with the quiet grace of someone acknowledging another soul. "Sleep any better?" he called. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I did, actually. Thank you. For the blanket." He shrugged. "Wasn't much." "It was enough," she said softly. For a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between them, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words ever could. Then the boy tugged at Caleb's sleeve, and the moment slipped away. Later that day, while Caleb mended the fence, Evelyn gathered wildflowers along the creek. The storm had scattered the petals, but a few still clung stubbornly to life. She picked a small handful pale yellow, soft white, and carried them back to her cabin, setting them in a chipped jar by the window. The sight of them made the room feel less borrowed, more hers. That evening, the children came by with a basket of biscuits and honey. "Pa said you might be hungry," the oldest boy explained, his face red from the wind. Evelyn thanked them, her voice thick with emotion. "You're all very kind." The middle child, a quiet girl with a tangle of curls, looked up and said, "Pa says folks gotta look out for each other out here, or the land'll swallow you whole." Evelyn smiled. "Your pa sounds like a wise man." The girl shrugged. "He just listens to the wind." When they ran off, laughing, Evelyn stood at the door, watching them disappear into the fading light. She thought about how easily kindness had begun to weave itself into her days here, a loaf of bread, a blanket, a shared word. No grand gestures, just small mercies that made the world feel less cruel. That night, she opened her journal again. The ink flowed more easily this time. There is goodness in silence. She wrote, "Sometimes it comes with calloused hands and tired eyes. Sometimes it knocks only once, then leaves before you can say thank you." She paused, pen hovering, then added, "I think I'm beginning to believe this place might let me breathe again." The candle burned low as she set the book aside. Outside, the wind had quieted, and for the first time since arriving in Willow Bend, she slept through the night without dreaming of escape. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and somewhere between the sound of birds and the smell of coffee. Evelyn Pierce felt the first fragile stirrings of trust. The air outside Willow Bend was cool and bright, carrying that rare sweetness the earth gives after rain. Dew clung to the tall grass, and the world seemed to hold its breath. From her cabin window, Evelyn saw smoke rising gently from the main house chimney, curling into the pale light. It was a quiet kind of welcome one that didn't need words. She dressed slowly, still wrapped in the blanket he had given her the night before. Every thread of it carried a memory of kindness, the kind that asked nothing in return. When she stepped outside, the morning sun touched her face like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Caleb Rowan was already at the outdoor stove, the scent of cornmeal and fresh coffee drifting through the yard. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands busy at work. The children sat nearby, waiting with the patient hunger of farm life. "Good morning," Evelyn called softly, her voice unsure, like a bird testing the air. Caleb looked up, nodded once. "Mornin'. Hope the roof held through the storm." "It did," she said, smiling faintly, "and thank you for checking on me last night." He shrugged, not looking at her. "Just didn't want you freezing out there. The desert's got a mean chill when it wants to." The oldest boy grinned. "Pa made cornbread, ma'am. He only burns it half the time." Caleb shot the boy a look, and Evelyn laughed a real laugh, soft and unexpected. The sound startled her as much as it seemed to please him. "Well," she said, "half-burned sounds better than none at all." He handed her a tin cup of coffee, his fingers brushing hers just briefly enough to remind her she was here, alive, not a ghost wandering through someone else's mercy. "Sit," he said. "You might as well eat before the kids leave you nothin'." She took a place beside the small table, the children watching her with open curiosity. The youngest girl, no more than 6, offered a piece of cornbread from her plate. "It's got honey on it," she whispered, as though sharing a great secret. Evelyn accepted it carefully. "Thank you, sweetheart. Her name's June," Caleb said. "Middle one's Henry. The tall one, Sam, thinks he's already a man." Sam rolled his eyes, earning laughter from his siblings. Evelyn smiled into her coffee, feeling something loosen inside her chest. After breakfast, the children ran off toward the creek, their laughter echoing through the open air. Caleb stayed behind, washing the tin plates with slow, steady movements. Evelyn gathered the crumbs into a cloth, an old habit from a life of scarcity. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know," she answered, "but I want to." He didn't argue. For a while they worked side by side in the soft hum of morning. Then Evelyn noticed something beyond the fence line, a small patch of white shining in the sunlight. Curious, she set down the plates and walked closer. There, by the garden, grew a cluster of white daisies, their petals still damp from rain, their stems trembling slightly in the breeze. She knelt beside them, heart catching in her throat. "My mother loved these," she murmured. She said they were stubborn little things, always growing back, no matter how rough the season. Caleb's voice came from behind her. My mother used to say, if you plant what makes you happy, happiness will find its way home again." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes bright in the morning light. "Did she plant these?" He nodded. "Long time ago. Haven't seen 'em bloom in years. Not since." His words trailed off, fading into the air like dust. Evelyn didn't press. Instead, she reached out and brushed her fingertips across the soft petals. "They came back," she said gently. He studied her for a moment, the way her face softened in the light, the way her voice carried both sorrow and hope. Maybe the land finally decided to remember. For the first time, she looked him in the eye without flinching. Maybe we both did. A faint smile crossed his lips, the kind that starts in the heart before it reaches the mouth. The day stretched quiet and steady. Evelyn helped June hang linens on the line, the white fabric billowing like sails in the wind. Caleb rode out to mend a fence along the ridge, leaving her with the slow rhythm of the homestead, the creak of the windmill, the buzz of bees, the heartbeat of a place beginning to feel like home. When he returned that afternoon, she had made supper, simple stew, nothing more. He looked at the table, surprised. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied again, smiling softly. "But I wanted to." He took his seat across from her, tipping his hat back, eyes tired but peaceful. It's been a while since there's been someone here who wanted to. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't the awkward kind anymore. It was the quiet, shared by people learning to trust it. When the meal was done, Evelyn rose to clear the dishes, but Caleb stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "You did the cookin'. Let me handle the rest." And for the first time, she let someone else take over. As dusk fell, the children came in from the yard. Smelling of grass and laughter, Caleb lit a lantern, and its glow cast the room in honey-colored light. Evelyn watched them all, the man, the children, the table, and something deep within her shifted, like the slow turning of the earth. This wasn't love yet, but it was trust, beginning to bloom fragile, stubborn, like the daisies by the garden. Later that night, when she returned to her cabin, the stars had scattered across the sky like spilled salt. She looked toward the house and saw the lantern still glowing in the window. For the first time since arriving in Willow Bend, she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She whispered to the dark, "Maybe your mother was right. Caleb, maybe happiness does find its way home." And as the wind swept gently through the cottonwoods, Evelyn felt the truth of it settle in her bones, quiet, steady, real. By the next morning, the soil around the daisies had begun to dry, and as Evelyn Pierce knelt to water them, she realized that some things like trust only grow when you tend them, day after day. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm, quiet and honest, the kind of rhythm that only life on the frontier could teach. The sun rose early over Willow Bend, spilling light across the fields, and every morning Evelyn found herself up before the children, watching the world wake as she brewed coffee in her small cabin. Sometimes she'd see Caleb Rowan already at work, a steady silhouette against the pale horizon, and she wondered if he ever truly rested. The daisies by the fence grew taller each morning. Their roots reached deep into the hard Nevada soil, and somehow, that small patch of white against all that brown reminded her that life, no matter how fragile, had a way of holding on. One afternoon, Evelyn followed the dirt path beyond the barn, drawn by the sound of the wind rustling through the cottonwoods. She found Caleb near the creek, mending a broken fence post beside a great old cottonwood tree, its trunk thick and scarred. One heavy branch snapped clean in half. He didn't notice her at first. His sleeves were rolled, hands rough with work, and the way he moved, patient, deliberate, spoke of a man used to fixing what others had long given up on. Evelyn stood quietly for a moment, watching the breeze stir through the leaves above them. The broken branch swayed lightly in the wind, still clinging to the tree by a strip of bark. "It looks like it's barely holding on," she said softly. Caleb turned, wiping the sweat from his brow. Ain't much life left in that limb, but the roots are still good. As long as they hold, the tree'll keep growing." She stepped closer, gazing up at the trunk. "Do you really think that's true? That something broken can still grow?" He leaned his weight against the shovel handle, eyes squinting at the light through the leaves. "I've seen it. Fences, horses, people. They all break, one way or another. But if the roots are strong, they find a way back." Evelyn smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and disbelief. "You make it sound so simple." Caleb shrugged. "Simple don't mean easy." The wind shifted, and the branches whispered above them. For a while, neither spoke. Evelyn knelt by the fallen limb, tracing the grain of the wood with her fingertips. It was rough, but warm from the sun, alive in its own way. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that once something was broken, once I was broken, that was it. No coming back, no fixing." Caleb's gaze softened, and now she looked up at him, the light catching in her eyes. "Now I think maybe I just needed better soil." He smiled, then not the half smile he wore out of habit, but something deeper, truer. The kind of smile that comes when a man recognizes a truth he's been carrying for years, but never had words for. "You're standing on good land, Evelyn," he said quietly. "It'll give back what you put into it." Her heart tightened, not because of the words themselves, but because he meant them in the way only a man who had lost everything could mean them. They worked side by side that afternoon, she gathering fallen branches, he steadying the fence. It wasn't conversation that tied them together, but the simple act of being near. When the sun began to set, painting the land in amber and rose, Caleb brushed the dirt from his hands and looked at the old cottonwood again. "Used to be my wife's favorite tree," he said, voice low, almost hesitant. "She'd sit here with the kids in the evenings, telling stories about places she'd never seen." Said the wind in these branches sounded like the ocean. Evelyn felt the ache in those words, not just grief, but memory worn smooth by time. She didn't speak. Instead, she rested her hand lightly against the trunk. Then maybe it's still holding her stories. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something flickered across his face. Not longing, not yet, but recognition. A sense that this woman beside him, quiet and scarred in her own way, understood what it meant to live with ghosts and still wake up grateful for the morning. As they started back toward the house, Caleb paused to glance at the sky. "Storm's coming in again soon. You can feel it in the air." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon, where clouds gathered like smoke. "Storms don't scare me much anymore," she said softly. "Not after the ones I've already lived through." He gave a small, approving nod. "Then you'll do just fine out here." That evening, while Caleb was inside, tending the children, Evelyn returned to the cottonwood. The wind had picked up again, tossing the leaves in restless waves. She stood beneath its broken limb, thinking about everything he'd said about roots, and holding on, and the quiet strength it took to keep growing after loss. Kneeling down, she pressed her palm into the dirt at the base of the tree. The ground was warm, alive. She could feel the pulse of it, faint but steady, as if the earth itself was breathing. "I think I understand now," she whispered. "If the roots are good, the rest will find a way." For the first time since leaving Virginia, Evelyn smiled, not the cautious kind, not the one meant to please others, but a smile born of something real, something returning. When she looked back toward the house, she saw the light of the lantern flickering through the kitchen window. The sight filled her chest with a quiet peace, the kind that came not from safety, but from belonging. And as the night gathered around Willow Bend, Evelyn realized that the land, the man, and the family she had stumbled into might not just be her refuge. They might be the roots she had been searching for all along. But even the strongest roots hide what lies beneath. And before long, the past his and hers would rise again, demanding to be faced beneath that same cottonwood tree. It was early autumn in Willow Bend, the air sharp with the promise of frost. The fields stretched golden in the morning light, and the days had grown shorter, quieter, as if the land itself were taking a slow breath before winter. For weeks, life had found a rhythm between Evelyn Pierce and Caleb Rowan. Quiet mornings with coffee, long afternoons of work, and evenings where the silence between them felt less like distance and more like peace. Then, one morning, that peace was broken. Evelyn was hanging linens near the fence when she saw a cloud of dust rising from the ridge, a lone rider cutting across the plain. At first, she thought it might be a traveler passing through, but as the shape drew closer, her heart quickened. The horse was familiar. The man slumped in the saddle was not a stranger. "Caleb," she whispered, dropping the laundry basket. He rode into the yard barely holding the reins, his shirt torn and blood blooming across his side. He slid from the saddle before she could reach him, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Caleb Evelyn ran to him, knees hitting the dirt beside his body. His breathing was ragged, his face pale beneath a layer of dust. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Fence post. Broke loose," he murmured, eyes half shut. "Horse spooked. I'm fine." But he wasn't. The blood soaking through his shirt said otherwise. "Henry," she shouted toward the house, "get me a cloth now." The boy came running, eyes wide with fear, clutching a torn towel. Evelyn pressed it against the wound, trying to steady her shaking hands. Caleb winced, but didn't protest. "You're not fine," she said, voice low but firm. "Don't you dare lie to me about that." He almost smiled, almost. "You're bossy when you're scared. Then I'll be bossy all day if it keeps you alive," she shot back. They got him inside, onto the small bed in the front room. The children hovered near the doorway, pale and silent. Evelyn sent them to fetch hot water and thread, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. She tore away the bloodied fabric, revealing a deep gash along his ribs and beneath it, a map of scars that told a longer story. She froze. Some were old, white and roped, others newer, crossing his back and shoulder like the ghosts of old battles. "These aren't from fence posts," she whispered. Caleb's eyes opened, gray and distant. "No," he said quietly. "Those are older sins." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind pressed against the windows. Evelyn dipped the cloth in warm water and began to clean the wound, her movements careful, reverent. "When I came here," she said softly, "I thought the West would be full of men who'd never seen war. I guess I was wrong." His breath caught on a quiet laugh. "No one who's lived through war ever really leaves it behind. We just trade one kind of fight for another." She stitched the cut in silence, listening to the faint hitch in his breathing with every pull of the needle. When she finished, she sat back, wiping her brow. "You should rest." But he didn't. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the window, toward the cottonwood outside. "I wasn't always a rancher," he said after a long pause. "I served in the cavalry, late in the war. They sent us to clear out a small settlement, said it was harboring raiders. But it wasn't." Evelyn's hands stilled. They were farmers. Families. A few tried to run, and my captain ordered us to burn them out. I refused. He called me a coward, tied me to a post, and left me there for 2 days under the sun. His voice didn't waver, but the weight of it filled the room like smoke. When they finally pulled me free, I couldn't lift a rifle again. Not for them. Not for anyone. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "So you came here," she said quietly. He nodded. "Came west to disappear. Thought maybe if I buried myself in the land, I could grow something good out of what I'd done or what I couldn't stop." She reached for his hand, her fingers light against his rough skin. "You didn't do wrong, Caleb. You chose mercy when everyone else chose hate." He looked at her then, really looked as if trying to decide whether to believe her. "You sound sure of that." "I am," she said, "because I know what it means to carry guilt that isn't yours." Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, but recognition. "What happened to you?" "Evelyn." Her lips parted, then closed again. The truth pressed at the edges of her heart, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. "Another time," she said. "When you're stronger." He nodded, the hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Fair trade? That night, Evelyn kept watch by his bedside. The children had fallen asleep, and the only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. She traced the lantern's glow across his face, the lines carved by years of hardship, the quiet strength beneath the exhaustion. Outside, the cottonwood stood unmoving in the moonlight, its broken branch swaying slightly in the wind. She thought of his words, "If the roots are strong, it'll keep growing." Maybe that was true for people too. She reached for his hand, not out of duty but instinct. His fingers curled weakly around hers, and for a long time she simply sat there, holding the silence between them like something sacred. By dawn, the fever had broken. Caleb stirred, eyes half open, and managed a faint smile. "Guess I didn't die." Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Not on my watch. Reckon I owe you my life, then." "You don't owe me anything," she said softly. "Just don't ride alone next time." He nodded, and for the first time, she saw not the soldier or the widower, but the man beneath it all, weary but still willing to hope. And as the light poured through the window, Evelyn knew that something had shifted between them. His truth had cracked something open, not just in him, but in her too. The kind of understanding that doesn't come from words, but from recognizing the same kind of ache in another's soul. That evening, as she mended his torn shirt by the fire, Evelyn Pierce realized that sometimes the act of sewing wasn't about fixing cloth. It was about holding two broken lives together, one quiet stitch at a time. The lamp burned low in the front room of the ranch house. Outside, Willow Bend lay wrapped in stillness, the fields silvered by moonlight. Inside, the faint crackle of the fire was the only sound that in the soft rasp of thread pulling through fabric. Caleb Rowan slept fitfully in the chair near the hearth, his bandaged side rising and falling beneath a clean cotton shirt. The fever had passed, leaving behind the gray exhaustion of a man who had fought too many battles, some on fields of war, others within himself. Evelyn sat across from him, her fingers working in slow rhythm, mending the torn seams of the shirt he'd been wearing when he fell. Every stitch was a kind of prayer not spoken aloud, but felt in the steady beat of her hands. She'd always found comfort in sewing, back east, when the world had turned cold and unkind. Her mother's voice would whisper over her shoulder, If you can't mend what's been done, mend what's in your hands. It'll help you remember you're still here. So she did. And tonight, in this small room lit by firelight and quiet mercy, she mended not just the shirt, but something far more fragile, the space that had once lived between them. Caleb stirred in his chair, the movement breaking the silence. "You should rest," he murmured, voice rough from sleep. Evelyn didn't look up. "I will. Soon." His gaze drifted to the fabric in her lap. "You don't have to fix that." "I know," she said softly, "but I want to." He smiled faintly, that quiet half-smile she'd begun to recognize, the one that spoke of gratitude he didn't know how to name. "You've got a habit of wanting to fix things that don't ask to be fixed." Evelyn met his eyes across the firelight. "Maybe I just don't like leaving things undone." He nodded, eyes falling closed again. "Guess that makes two of us." The warmth between them was quiet, unspoken, the kind that hums beneath words instead of filling them. Later, when his breathing deepened into sleep, Evelyn set down her needle and watched him for a long while. The firelight cast soft shadows across his face, softening the lines time and sorrow had carved there. For the first time, she noticed how peaceful he looked, not because life had been kind, but because he had made peace with its cruelty. She wondered if anyone had ever cared for him like this before, gently, without expectation. The thought ached inside her chest. She rose quietly, draped the mended shirt across the back of a chair, and went to stir the coals in the stove. The flame flared up, throwing new light across the room, and for a moment, her eyes caught on the small wooden box sitting on the shelf by the window. She'd seen Caleb glance at it once, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Curiosity tugged at her, but she turned away. Whatever lay inside that box wasn't hers to know, not yet. Instead, she returned to her chair and picked up her mother's old journal. The pages smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. She opened it to a blank page and began to write, the pen scratching softly against the paper. "He told me about the war," she wrote, "about the things he couldn't do and the things he couldn't stop others from doing. I think guilt is a kind of wound that never truly closes. But tonight, I saw something else in him. Not regret, not pain, just grace, the kind that grows quietly in the cracks of a broken heart." The door creaked open, and she looked up. Caleb stood there, leaning against the frame, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "I thought you were asleep," she said. He gave a slow shake of his head. "The fire got too quiet. I woke up thinking I'd lost something." She smiled. "You didn't. It's right there." She nodded toward the chair where the mended shirt hung. He followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "You didn't have to do that." Evelyn closed the journal. "I know, but maybe I needed to." He took a step closer, the floorboards creaking softly under his boots. "You're a strange woman. Evelyn Pierce. I've been called worse." That drew a low, tired laugh from him, the kind that carried warmth even through weariness. "You remind me of that old tree out back. Bent some, scarred some, but still standing." "Then I'll take that as a compliment," she said, smiling. "It is," he replied, his voice softer now. "That tree's got more courage than most men I know." For a long moment, they just stood there, two people, bound by silence, finding comfort in the simple fact of being seen. When he finally turned to go, she reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Caleb." He stopped, glancing back. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth, for trusting me with it." He hesitated, then nodded. Didn't feel like much of a choice. You look at me like you already know what I'm going to say. Maybe that's because I've spent a long time learning how to listen, she said quietly. He studied her for a heartbeat, then tipped his hat an old habit, softened into something tender, and walked back to his room. Evelyn sat there for a while after he left, the fire burning low again. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes after a confession not empty, but full of everything unspoken. She reached for the mended shirt and ran her thumb over the new stitches. They were uneven in places, but strong. The fabric would hold. So would she. Outside. The wind brushed against the windows, whispering through the cottonwoods. Evelyn thought of Caleb's scars, of her own hidden ones, and of how maybe, just maybe, they were both learning how to live with the things they couldn't erase, how to make something tender out of what was once painful. She folded the shirt neatly, set it beside the fire, and whispered into the quiet room, where both still standing. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. But peace, like stitches, can only hold so long, and before the week was out, the past she thought she'd outrun would find its way to Willow Bend, calling her by the name she'd tried so hard to forget. The morning started like any other. The wind was soft, the kind that carried the scent of sage and damp earth after an early rain. Evelyn Pierce had hitched the wagon for a weekly trip into town flour, coffee, sugar, and a few bolts of cloth if she could afford them. Caleb Rowan had insisted she take the older mare. Junebug, slower but steadier on the rocky road. You'll be safe on her, he'd said, tightening the reins. Safe. The word had sounded almost foreign. She'd smiled, thanked him, and promised to be home before sundown. The children had waved from the porch, and for a moment, everything had felt simple. By the time she reached the main street of Willow Bend, the day had turned bright and warm. Dust swirled around the boots of townsfolk and the iron wheels of wagons. Evelyn greeted the storekeeper, Mrs. Holloway, with a polite smile, traded eggs for salt, and picked through a small bin of apples that looked a little bruised but smelled like heaven. It wasn't until she stepped back into the sunlight, basket in hand, that she heard a voice from somewhere down the street, rough and familiar in a way that made her blood run cold. Well, I'll be damned. Evelyn Hart. Her fingers went numb. No one had called her that name in years. Slowly, she turned. The man standing there wore a black coat, dusty from travel, his beard grayer than she remembered, but his eyes the same mean, sharp, and far too knowing. Silas Kane. The name crashed through her like a storm. Didn't expect to see you this far west, he said, his grin twisting. Figured you burned up with the rest of 'em. The basket slipped from her hands, apples rolling across the dirt. Don't, she whispered. Silas took a step closer, his boots crunching against the ground. What's the matter? Darlin thought I was doing you a favor, setting that place right. You were too good for that life. Remember, the words scraped across her heart like broken glass. The flames, the screams, her mother's voice. Everything she had buried clawed its way back into the light. Evelyn stumbled back, shaking her head. You're not real, she whispered. You can't be. Oh, I'm real enough. He sneered. You just changed your name. Thought you could hide from the past. Not much of a trick, sweetheart. Not when you left ashes in your wake. Something inside her broke then. Without another word, she turned and ran. The sound of her boots on the dirt echoed through the street. People called after her, confused, concerned, but she couldn't stop. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The road blurred. The air itself felt like fire. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun had already begun to fall, streaking the sky in bruised gold and rose. She barely remembered tying up the horse before stumbling into her cabin, slamming the door behind her, and sinking to the floor. The room was spinning. Her hands trembled violently as she pressed them to her chest, trying to breathe, but all she could see were the flames, the bodies, her old home collapsing into a roar of smoke and heat. "Run, Evelyn, go." Her father's voice, her mother's hand shoving her through the doorway, then nothing but fire. She pressed her fists to her ears, trying to push the memory out, but it came anyway, sharp and merciless. When the tears came, they came hard. Night fell. Caleb returned late from checking the southern pasture. The house was quiet, too quiet. The children had eaten their supper and gone to bed, whispering that Miss Evelyn hadn't come by for hours. His gut tightened. He crossed the yard, lantern in hand, and knocked lightly on her door. Evelyn. No answer. He waited, then turned the handle. The door creaked open. She was sitting on the floor near the hearth, knees drawn to her chest, face pale and streaked with tears. The room was dim except for the dying glow of the fire. Caleb froze, taking in the sight, the basket overturned, apples scattered, her hands clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. He didn't ask what happened, didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he stepped inside quietly, set the lantern on the table, and went to the stove. He poured what was left of the stew into a bowl, reheated it, and set it gently near her. "Eat when you can," he said softly. She didn't move, so he didn't press. He pulled up a chair by the door and sat down, hat resting on his knee. The fire cracked, throwing faint shadows across his face. Outside, the wind rose again, brushing against the cottonwoods. He stayed there all night silent, steady, a quiet guard against ghosts neither of them could name. Near dawn, Evelyn stirred. Her eyes were swollen, her throat raw, but the sight of him there slouched in the chair, chin resting against his chest, made something inside her break in a different way. She reached out, her fingers barely grazing the edge of the bowl. It was still warm. He hadn't asked what haunted her. He hadn't offered comfort she wasn't ready for. He had simply stayed. And that, somehow, was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. When Caleb finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was her sitting by the hearth again, the faintest light of morning on her face. "Didn't mean to fall asleep," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. She shook her head. "I'm glad you did." He studied her a moment. "You don't have to tell me," he said quietly. "Whatever it was that found you yesterday, it can wait. But it can't live here forever. Not if you want to stay whole." Her voice broke when she spoke. "I lost everything once. Caleb, I can't lose it again." He reached for his hat, turned it in his hands, and said simply, "Then you won't." And though the sun rose bright over Willow Bend that morning, it was patience, not daylight, that began to thaw the fear inside Evelyn Pierce, one quiet hour at a time. The days that followed moved slowly, like the turning of a wagon wheel through deep mud, steady, deliberate, never hurried. Caleb Rowan didn't press her to speak of what had happened in town. He didn't mention the man, or the name she'd once carried, or the terror that had chased her home. Instead, he gave her space and silence, and the kind of steady presence that made her feel the world wasn't quite as cruel as it once had been. Every morning, she'd find some small sign that he'd thought of her, a basket of fresh eggs by her door, a repaired latch on her window, the woodpile stacked neatly higher than she'd left it. He never said anything about it, and she never thanked him out loud. But she noticed. And sometimes, noticing is all a wounded heart can manage. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after that awful day in town, Evelyn gathered her courage and stepped beyond the edge of the yard. The air was warm again. The sky stretched wide and forgiving. She followed the path toward the cottonwood by the creek, the same one Caleb had once told her could grow again, if the roots stayed strong. She sat beneath it for a long while, her back against the bark, and let the sound of the wind through the leaves wash over her. She breathed deeply, slow and even, and for the first time in months, the sound didn't remind her of fire. When she looked up, she saw Caleb returning from the far field, his figure small against the horizon. He was walking beside Mrs. Holloway, the widow who ran the town's general store. The woman carried a bundle in her arms, and Caleb held another, heavier load, likely feed or flour. They stopped at her wagon, exchanged a few quiet words, and then he lifted his hat before walking back toward the ranch. Evelyn watched from the distance, unnoticed, the corner of her mouth softening. There was no grand gesture, no need for thanks or praise, just a man helping because it was in his nature to do so. When he passed near her on the path, he tipped his hat in greeting. "Didn't mean to disturb your peace," he said. "You didn't," she replied. "I was just listening." He nodded toward the tree. "It's a good place for that." She smiled faintly. "You help Mrs. Holloway often." He shrugged. "When she lets me. Her boy's been gone a year now. Folks forget how hard loneliness can bite when the chores pile up." Evelyn looked down at her hands. "You help a lot of people, don't you?" Caleb rubbed at the back of his neck, a little embarrassed. "Don't know about that. Just figure if a man's got 2 good hands, he ought to use 'em for something more than his own keep." Something inside her shifted at those words, something small but undeniable. She wanted to tell him she understood, that she knew what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. But instead, she only said, "That's a rare way of thinking." He gave her a look that was almost a smile. "Maybe, but it keeps me busy." That evening, the wind changed again. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, carrying the smell of rain. Caleb worked late to bring the horses in, and Evelyn found herself waiting by the porch with a lantern, watching the dark gather on the horizon. When he finally returned, soaked to the bone, she was standing by the door with a towel. "Didn't expect an audience?" he said, shaking rain from his hat. She laughed softly. "You were taking too long. Thought you might have melted out there. Wouldn't be the first time a storm got the better of me," he said, eyes twinkling beneath the brim. She handed him the towel, and for a moment their fingers brushed, a small, fleeting thing, but enough to send a quiet warmth through her chest. Inside, she ladled stew into bowls and set one in front of him without asking. They ate mostly in silence, the rain tapping against the windows like a steady drumbeat. At one point, Caleb said softly, "You seem better lately." Evelyn glanced at him. "Maybe I am." He nodded. "Good. You don't owe me an explanation, but I wanted you to know. Whatever happened before, it doesn't change who you are now." Her throat tightened. "You say that like you know me." He looked at her, then really looked, the way he always did when he meant something. "I know the kind of person who stays when it's easier to run, and I know the kind who plants daisies in hard soil. That's enough." Evelyn lowered her eyes. tears pricking at the corners. "You make it sound simple." "It is." He said, "We just forget that." Later that night, after he'd gone to check the barn doors, Evelyn sat by the fire with her journal open on her lap. The ink bled slightly on the page as she wrote, the words coming slower than usual, careful, deliberate. "Tonight I watched a man help without expecting to be seen. He fixed a widow's wagon. He carried her grief as quietly as he carried her flower. And I realized something kindness doesn't shout here. It doesn't need to. It just stays." She paused, the pen hovering above the paper. "Maybe I'm not afraid to love anymore. Maybe love isn't what I thought it was, not grand or loud or certain. Maybe it's just patience, wrapped in silence, waiting for someone to notice." She closed the book and sat for a long while, staring into the fire. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, and she could hear Caleb humming low in the barn. Some old tune, slow and familiar. The kind a man sings only when he thinks no one's listening. And for the first time in a long, long while, Evelyn felt her heart answer. But even as warmth found its way between them, words left unspoken can build walls of their own, and soon silence would test what trust had only just begun to grow. The autumn days in Willow Bend came shorter now, the wind carrying a hint of frost that whispered of early snow. The land itself seemed quieter, the way it gets when everything living prepares to endure what's coming. Evelyn Pierce could feel that same quiet taking root inside her. She and Caleb Rowan still shared their mornings, their coffee, their small, wordless moments, but something about them had changed. It wasn't distance she could name, not yet, just a space between words, as though both were afraid to step too close to whatever waited on the other side. It began the night he went looking for an extra blanket. The house was colder than usual, the stove burning low. Caleb, half-dressed and bone-tired from a day fixing fence posts, had gone into her cabin to fetch one of the spare quilts he'd lent her. He meant only to be a moment. But on the small table near her bed, left open as though she'd been writing and stepped away, lay her journal. The firelight caught the edge of the page. He didn't mean to look. He told himself he wouldn't. But one line, clear and dark, drew his eyes before he could turn away. "I didn't come to Willow Bend because I needed him. I came because I needed to run to forget what I left behind." The words hit like a silent blow. Caleb stood there, breath caught somewhere between surprise and something far heavier. For a moment, he thought about closing the book, pretending he'd never seen it. But you can't unsee a truth once it's found you. He folded the blanket under his arm, turned off the lamp, and stepped outside into the cold night. The next morning, Evelyn noticed it right away. He greeted her, but the softness was gone from his voice. He poured her coffee, but didn't meet her eyes. And when she asked about the fence line, his answers were short, clipped. At first, she thought it was the cold weather, or the ache still lingering from his injury. But later, as he hitched the wagon and left for town without a word, she felt it, that quiet withdrawal, sharp as a splinter. That evening, when he didn't return until after dark, she knew something was wrong. The children had long gone to bed when she finally found him sitting outside, his chair tilted back, staring toward the cottonwoods that stood dark against the horizon. The lantern beside him flickered low, throwing thin light across his face. "You're late," she said quietly, stepping onto the porch. "Had to help at the livery," he replied, not looking up. "That all?" He gave a slow nod. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them felt heavy like the calm before thunder. Evelyn's hands twisted together, the chill settling deep in her bones. "Caleb," she said finally, "did I do something wrong?" His jaw tightened. "Don't reckon that's for me to say. I'd like to know if I did." He looked at her then, his gray eyes steady but full of something she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, but quiet hurt. "You don't owe me explanations. Evelyn, you came here with your own reasons. Ain't my place to question 'em." Her breath caught. "So that's it. You're just going to shut me out." He shook his head slowly. "No, I'm just trying to remember what this was, what it wasn't." She took a step closer. "What are you talking about?" He hesitated, then said it, the words low and almost reluctant. "I read it. In your book." Her blood went cold. "My book didn't mean to," he said. "Wasn't looking for it. But I saw enough to understand." Evelyn froze. Her journal, the line she'd written weeks ago, the one that had felt harmless then, an echo of who she'd been when she first arrived. "I see," she whispered. He set his hat down, rubbing the back of his neck. "You said you came here to run, that you didn't need me. I suppose that's fair. I just—" He stopped. The rest caught in his throat. "Caleb," that was before he lifted a hand. "Quiet but firm. Don't—" "It's fine. It's not fine," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to let me explain." He looked away, toward the dark horizon. Maybe another time. That night. Evelyn couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, and the loneliness in her chest grew louder with every gust. She sat at her table, staring at the journal she'd once trusted like a friend. The words on those pages had been her refuge, a way to pour out the things she couldn't say aloud. But now they had betrayed her. Or maybe, she thought bitterly, she had betrayed herself. She opened to the page he'd read. The ink was still faintly smudged where her hand had trembled. She reread the line and felt the weight of it. How cruel it must have sounded to a man who had only ever given without asking. She dipped her pen again and began to write. "I wrote those words when I was still afraid of kindness, when I didn't believe it could be real. But I see now what I couldn't then, that running doesn't end when your feet stop moving. It ends when someone gives you a reason to stay." She closed the book and set it aside. Tomorrow, she would show him, or try to. But the next morning, Caleb left before sunrise. The house felt emptier than it had in months. His chair sat vacant at the table, his coffee cup still turned upside down. The children asked if he was coming back for supper, and she didn't know what to tell them. She spent the day working, chopping wood, hauling water, mending fences, anything to quiet the noise inside her. But every sound, every corner of that place, carried some trace of him. When the sun set, she walked out to the cottonwood. The air was cold and still, the first snow beginning to fall. She rested her palm against the bark and whispered into the wind. "You said if the roots are strong, the tree keeps growing. Then why does it feel like mine are breaking?" The tree didn't answer, but the silence felt kinder than the one inside the house. By the time the first snow settled over Willow Bend, regret had taken root, and when fire came to the valley once more, it would burn away the last of their silence, leaving only the truth behind. The winter winds were cruel that year, slicing through the canyons with the sound of morning. For weeks, Evelyn Pierce and Caleb Rowan moved around each other like ghosts, polite, quiet, careful not to touch what had already been broken. The words she had written still hung between them, invisible but heavy, and neither of them seemed to know how to set it down. The children noticed, Of course. They always did. Little June stopped leaving her drawings on Evelyn's doorstep. Sam, who'd once called her Miss Eve, went back to Ma'am. Only Henry still lingered by the barn sometimes, offering small talk and shy glances, like he was afraid to hope the warmth might return. Evelyn bore it in silence. She told herself it was what she deserved, that some hurts had to be waited out. Not mended, but the waiting hurt more than she'd expected. Then, one gray afternoon, the wind changed. It started as a scent, dry and sharp, carried down from the western hills. Smoke. Caleb was the first to see the red smear rising beyond the ridge. "Wildfire," he said. His voice clipped. "All business now. Too close to the timber line." By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of rusted copper. They worked side by side, through the dark, wetting the fields, digging trenches, driving the animals toward the creek. Evelyn moved as if her body already knew what to do, hauling water, carrying blankets, trying not to look toward the ridge where the glow grew brighter. The wind roared like a living thing, scattering embers across the yard. One landed near the porch, catching in the straw. Caleb stomped it out with his boot, then turned to her. "If it gets any closer, you take the children and go east. Don't wait for me." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." He gave her a hard look, not unkind, but commanding. "Evelyn, no," she said again. "I've run enough for one lifetime." Something flickered behind his eyes, then something like pride, or fear, or both. He didn't argue after that. The fire came faster than either of them expected. By dawn, the hills were burning. The air was thick with smoke, turning breath into pain. Evelyn had sent the children with the neighbors, her heart clenching as she watched the wagon vanish into the haze. When she turned back, Caleb was gone. "Caleb," she called, coughing. The only answer was the crack and hiss of burning wood. She ran toward the barn, toward the place where the fire seemed brightest. Inside, she found him not fighting the flames, but searching through the smoke. "What are you doing?" she cried. He turned, his face streaked with soot. "My ledger," he shouted. "It's in the chest. I can't leave it." The wooden rafters groaned above them. She saw what he was reaching for, a small leather-bound book, blackened along the edges. He grabbed it, coughing hard, and nearly stumbled. Evelyn ran to him, grabbing his arm, dragging him toward the open door. "Leave it," she yelled. "I can't," he rasped. "It's all I have left of them." Outside, the world burned red. They collapsed beside the trough, gasping. Caleb clutched the book to his chest, his hands shaking. Evelyn stared at it. The cover scorched, the edges singed, and suddenly understood. It wasn't a ledger. It was a memory, a record of everything he'd lost. His wife, the war, the years he'd spent trying to become something decent again. He had written it all down because it was the only way to keep living. Without thinking, she reached for the book. "Don't," he said weakly. But she opened it anyway. The pages inside were filled with his handwriting, steady, deliberate, and between them, small drawings of faces she didn't know, children's scrawls, a pressed daisy, a prayer written in a soldier's hand. Evelyn looked up at him, tears cutting through the ash on her cheeks. "I can't let this burn," she whispered, "because this is you." He blinked at her, stunned. "Evelyn." She pressed the book back into his hands. "You think all you've got left is what's written in there, but you're wrong. You're right here. You're what's left." For a heartbeat, the firelight flickered in his eyes. and something inside him broke not in pain, but in surrender. He pulled her close, his voice low, raw. "You should have left. You should have run." "I'm done running," she said. And there, in the orange glow of the burning world, they held each other, two souls who had survived more than the land could take, finding something worth keeping in the middle of ruin. The flames raged around them, the air alive with heat and noise, but it felt strangely quiet inside that moment. Caleb's hand came up, tracing the soot on her face. "You weren't running from me," he said softly. "You were just trying to find a place to stop." Evelyn nodded, tears spilling freely now. "And I did. Here." He kissed her, then slow, certain, tasting of smoke and sorrow and all the things they'd finally stopped hiding from. The fire might have taken the house. It might have taken the barns, the fences, the fields. But it couldn't take what had grown between them, something born not out of need or fear, but out of the long, patient mercy of two hearts that had finally dared to stay. When the sun rose the next morning, the valley was black with ash. The cottonwoods stood bare, their limbs scarred and twisted, but still upright. The creek smoked faintly in the cold air. Caleb and Evelyn sat side by side on the porch steps, or what was left of them, wrapped in the same blanket, the rescued book between them. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was full. She rested her head against his shoulder. "We'll build again," she said quietly. He nodded. "Yeah, we will." And when he opened the book once more, the words that met his eyes weren't his own. They were hers, written in the margin, the ink still fresh. Love doesn't always begin in peace. Sometimes it starts in fire, and what survives is what was meant to. When the snows came that winter, the land slept under its blanket of white and from the blackened soil of Willow Bend. Something tender began to take root once more. By March, the air began to soften. The winds that once carried smoke now carried the faintest hint of rain, and the ash that had blanketed the fields turned into dark, rich earth. The world was healing. Slowly and without announcement, the way all living things do when they've been given another chance. Evelyn Pierce spent her mornings by the creek, her skirts damp with dew, her hands buried in the soil. She was replanting the flower beds that the fire had taken daisies, wild sage, and the pale blue flax that her mother once loved. Her fingers still bore the marks of the burns she'd gotten that night, faint scars that felt less like reminders of pain and more like proof of what had been worth saving. Caleb Rowan, meanwhile, worked with quiet resolve. The barns were gone, the fences half standing, but his shoulders seemed lighter now, as though the fire had burned away more than just wood. Each morning, he rose before dawn, his breath fogging in the cold, and went about the work of rebuilding not just the ranch, but the rhythm of their lives. The house came back first a small, sturdy thing made of pine, with windows that caught the afternoon sun and a porch that faced west, where the cottonwoods had once stood. It was Evelyn's idea to plant a willow there instead. "Nothing else holds the earth together quite like its roots," she'd said. Caleb smiled at that, the quiet, knowing kind of smile that held more gratitude than words ever could. Spring came early that year. The first buds appeared in April, shy and green against the blackened trunks. The river swelled with melted snow, singing again through the valley. And one morning, when Evelyn stepped outside, she saw a single wild daisy blooming in the field, the first life to rise from the ashes. She knelt beside it, touched its petals with trembling fingers, and whispered, "Welcome back." From that day on, it became their ritual small acts of rebuilding that meant more than either could say aloud. A new fence post hammered in beside an old one, a loaf of bread rising in the oven while the scent of sawdust filled the house. Silence, but the easy kind, shared between two people who no longer needed to hide behind words. Sometimes, Caleb caught himself watching her, not in the way a man studies something fragile, but in the way a weary traveler studies the horizon, knowing it means home. One morning, he found her sitting on the porch, her hair loose, sunlight tangled in its strands. She was carving something from a piece of wood, a small, imperfect circle. "What's that?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Just something to keep my hands busy," he nodded, taking the seat beside her. After a long pause, he said, "You ever think about what comes next?" Her knife paused mid-cut. Next, after all this, he gestured to the fields, to the half-built barn, to the life still taking shape around them. She studied him, her eyes soft but steady. "I think, maybe next, is just more of this. Workin', living, trying not to forget what mattered." He looked down, a small chuckle rumbling in his chest. "That sounds about right." But later, when she wasn't looking, he turned the thought over in his mind, again and again, because he'd been thinking about what came next too. And for the first time in years, it wasn't a grave, or an empty chair, or a field that needed mending. It was her. A few days later, Caleb disappeared into the woods before sunrise. Evelyn thought little of it at first. He often did that, walking the land like a man reacquainting himself with something half-remembered. But when he returned at dusk, his hands were full of willow branches, still green and fragrant. He worked late that night in the shed, the sound of carving and sanding drifting faintly through the open window. Evelyn watched the lamplight flicker against the walls, the rhythm of his work calm and sure. When he finally came inside, his hands were covered in sawdust, and something small rested in his palm. A ring, simple, smooth, carved from the heartwood of willow. He didn't say anything at first, just held it out to her, the lines in his face deep with both nerves and tenderness. "It's not much," he said quietly, "but it's from what's left of the tree that burned by the creek. Figured, if it could grow again, maybe we could too." Evelyn's breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The ring was warm from his hand, light as a whisper, yet it felt like it carried the weight of everything they'd been through. She looked up at him, at this man who'd seen loss, who'd carried guilt like a second skin, who'd offered her patience instead of pity, silence instead of demands. And in that moment, she understood what love meant in the frontier, not grand declarations or perfect endings, but standing together when everything else had turned to ash. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "Caleb Rowan," she said softly, "you're the only thing I've ever chosen for myself." He smiled, then not wide, not showy, but real. "Is that a yes?" Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was steady. "It's a forever." They married in the small clearing by the creek, beneath the new willow sapling that had begun to take hold. There were no guests, no preacher, no music, just the sound of wind in the grass and the whisper of water over stone. Caleb slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, his hands trembling only slightly. "If a tree can grow back from fire," he said, voice thick with emotion, "then maybe two hearts can too." Evelyn's tears fell freely now, but they were not the kind that hurt. They were the kind that cleansed, the kind that belonged to people who have learned the difference between surviving and living. He drew her close, their foreheads touching, the wind lifting the edge of her hair. And for the first time since the fire, since the silence, since everything that had nearly broken them, she felt whole. That spring, the valley bloomed again. The daisies spread across the hills like a white sea, swaying in the gentle wind. The barn stood proud and new. The house smelled of bread and cedar. And each evening, when the sun slipped low behind the ridge, Caleb and Evelyn sat on the porch in their old rocking chairs, watching the light fade from gold to rose. There was no need for words between them any more. The land spoke for them in the rustle of the willow leaves, in the laughter of the children returning from the fields, in the quiet rhythm of two lives that had chosen to begin again. And sometimes, when she reached over to touch his hand, she'd feel the smooth wood of the ring warm, living, and eternal. And one evening, when the sun lingered longer than usual, and the air shimmered with that strange peace that comes only after loss, Caleb Rowan took Evelyn Pierce's hand, and together they stepped beneath the willow to dance to a song only their hearts could hear. The wind moved softly through Willow Bend that night, carrying the faint scent of new grass and rain. The valley had bloomed once more, wildflowers rising fearless from the black soil, their colors bold against the twilight. The willow, the same one they had planted together after the fire, stood tall now, its branches trailing like silk ribbons in the breeze, its leaves whispering as if telling stories to the stars. There was no music. There didn't need to be. The crickets kept time. The wind hummed low, and the creek murmured a melody older than any waltz. Caleb extended his hand rough, scarred, but steady. Evelyn smiled, her eyes reflecting the lantern light that swayed gently from a branch. "Out here?" she asked softly, amused. He nodded. "Out here. I'm not much of a dancer," she said. His lips curved. "Neither am I. Guess that makes us even." And with that, he pulled her close. They moved slowly at first, awkward, uncertain, their boots brushing through the grass, the rhythm hesitant, but as the minutes passed, something shifted. Her hands found his shoulders, his arms circled her waist, and the space between them disappeared like morning fog. The world around them fell away, the ranch, the fences, the long years behind them. There was only warmth and breath and the quiet heartbeat of two lives that had somehow found their way back to each other. Evelyn rested her head against his chest, listening. It was a steady, solid sound, the same one she had heard when he'd carried her through the smoke, when she'd sat by his bedside, tending to his wounds, when silence had once felt safer than love. "Do you remember?" she whispered. "The night after the fire." He nodded, his cheek brushing her hair. "Every bit of it. I thought we'd lost everything," she said. "And then I realized maybe we needed to see what really mattered." He smiled faintly, tightening his hold. "Reckon you're right about that. Some things only grow after you've burned down the old ones." The lantern flickered, its light catching in her hair like gold. Around them, the willow swayed, its branches bending low as if to listen. A cool breeze swept through, tugging gently at her dress, and Evelyn laughed a soft, unguarded sound that made Caleb's chest ache in the best way. It had been so long since he'd heard laughter like that, unburdened, free. He drew back just enough to see her face. "You look happy," he said quietly. "I am," she whispered. "For the first time, I think I truly am." He nodded, eyes glimmering. "That's all I ever wanted." Evelyn touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the faint line of a scar near his jaw. "You never asked for much, did you?" Caleb chuckled softly. "Guess not. Just wanted a bit of land, some peace, and someone who didn't scare easy." Her eyes softened. And you got all three. Sure did, he said, though you gave me more than I knew to ask for. She tilted her head. And what's that? He looked at her for a long time, the wind carrying the quiet between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, a reason to stay. They danced until the stars came out, not the polished kind of dance you'd see in a city ballroom, but the kind born from knowing someone's silences better than their words. Their movements were slow, uneven, but full of grace that came not from skill, but from love long earned and deeply kept. At one point, Evelyn's hand slipped from his shoulder to his heart. It beat strong beneath her palm, and she closed her eyes, feeling its rhythm. After everything, she said softly, how do you still believe in second chances? Caleb exhaled, his hand resting over hers. I don't reckon I ever stopped. The land does it every spring. The rivers do it after drought. Figured maybe folks like us ain't so different. She smiled through her tears. You make it sound simple. He shook his head gently. Not simple, just true. The moon rose high, silvering the grass. They stopped dancing then, but neither moved away. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers trembling slightly. Do you ever think about what we'd be? He asked quietly. If things had gone different, if there hadn't been a fire, or war, or all that hurt in between. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. No, she said, because I think this right here is the only way it ever could have been. We were meant to find each other through the ashes. He smiled at that, slow and deep. Then I guess I owe the fire some thanks. She laughed, soft and bright. Don't push your luck. Mr. Rowan. He grinned, pulling her close again. Fair enough. The night deepened. Above them, the willow swayed, its leaves whispering like a lullaby. Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like an ending. It felt like home. In that stillness, something sacred unfolded, not grand, not loud, but honest. Two people who had walked through grief, through fear, through flame itself, now stood beneath a tree that had once been ash, and they understood love wasn't the thing that saved them. It was the thing they had built patient, humble, and alive after being saved. Caleb's voice came low, almost to himself. You ever think about what comes next? Evelyn smiled against his chest. I think we just keep dancing. He nodded, his chin brushing her hair. Then let's not stop. And under the willow, with the stars watching like quiet witnesses, they swayed slow, gentle, perfectly in time. No music, no audience, only wind, only heartbeats. And somewhere in that stillness, the land seemed to breathe with them as if it, too, had learned how to begin again. When dawn came, they were still there, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her. The light filtered through the willow leaves, dappled gold and green. The fire scars on the bark caught the morning sun, glowing faintly like veins of amber. Evelyn stirred, half smiling. We should get to work soon. Caleb chuckled. Plenty of time for that. He kissed her temple, his voice soft as the wind. For now, I just want to remember this. She nodded, her fingers curling around his. Me too. And as the morning light rose higher over Willow Bend, two hearts once lost, once scarred, now whole beat quietly together beneath the willow that had learned, like them, to live again. After all, they had learned how to let two hearts beat as one, not in the rush of youth, but in the quiet strength of those who chose to stay. Out here on the frontier, where the wind never stops and the earth remembers every footprint, love is rarely about perfection. It's about endurance. It's about two souls finding warmth when the world gives them cold. Evelyn and Caleb's story reminds us that healing doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or sudden miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly in a cup of coffee shared at dawn, in a silence that no longer hurts, in the courage to stay when it would be easier to run. They teach us that second chances aren't just given. They're built with patience, forgiveness, and a kind of faith that grows even in burnt soil. The willow that rose again after the fire wasn't a symbol of luck. It was proof that what's meant to live will find a way, no matter how much it's been scarred. Maybe that's the truth we all need to remember. Love doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. And even after loss, after fear, after silence, there can still be a season of renewal, a second spring waiting for those brave enough to plant again. So tonight, as we close this story under the soft light of the frontier sky, we thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing that tenderness still has a place in this world. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a hope, a quiet corner of your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Each story we tell carries a piece of that old Western truth that no matter how rough the land, love still finds a way to bloom. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit, your hearts open, and never stop dancing beneath your own willow.